I just recently found out that I was supposed to speak for an hour and not 30 minutes, so we're going to see how this goes. But my story really began when I was 13, when a close family friend who was like an uncle to me actually passed away from pancreatic cancer. And when the disease hit so close to my home, I really needed to learn more. So I went to any teenager's best resources for knowledge, Google and Wikipedia, how to get through every high school test and quiz. And I found a database of over, and essentially what I found is like all these different statistics on pancreatic cancer. And what I found really appalled me. I mean, 85% of all pancreatic cancers are diagnosed late, when someone has less than a 2% chance of survival. And the reason for this is that our current method of diagnosing the cancer is the 60-year-old technique. I mean, that's older than my dad. But also, it costs $800 per test and is grossly inaccurate, missing 30% of all pancreatic cancers. Your doctor would have to be ridiculously suspicious that you have the cancer in order to give you this test. And so learning this, I was sure there had to be a better way. And so I set out armed with 9th grade biology to try and change cancer diagnostics. It's a bit lofty of a goal, but I was going to do it. And, ooh, my clicker has died. Oh, I was pressing the wrong button. And so what I found is that essentially, when we're looking for pancreatic cancer, we're looking at your bloodstream, particularly for these variations in the protein levels there. And while this sounds really straightforward, it's anything but, because you have these layers and layers of blood that's already abundant in protein, and you're looking for this tiny difference in this tiny amount of protein. It's next to impossible. It's like trying to find a needle in a sack of nearly identical needles. However, undeterred due to my teenage optimism, or how some people label it, complete and utter ignorance of the entire field, I looked at what a pancreatic cancer sensor would really have to look like in order to be effective. It would have to be inexpensive, rapid, simple, sensitive, selective, and minimally invasive. And then I realized in order to have a pancreatic cancer sensor, I'm going to have a protein to detect. So this is where the second part of my journey kind of came in. And I found a database of over 8,000 different proteins that are found in your bloodstream when you have these different cancers. And it was summer break. I had nothing else to do. And so I locked myself in my room and researched all 8,000 of them. It kind of felt like I was playing Pokemon, but instead of catching them all, I had to research them all. And it drove me quite insane. By the end of the summer, I thought I was really doubting like any potential for future social interaction. And it really made like some really awkward moments where I went back to school. I mean, like for those back to school essays, like, what did you do this summer? My friend said, oh, I went to Yellowstone. Jack, what did you do? I researched 8,000 proteins. There was always an awkward pause after that. My teacher never looked at me quite the same. However, eventually I found one protein that could work. And the name of this protein was called mesothelin. And it's just your ordinary run-of-the-mill type protein, unless you have pancreatic, ovarian, and lung cancer, in which case you have it at these very high levels in your bloodstream. But the key is that it's found in the earliest stages of the disease, when someone has close to 100% chance of survival. So now that I'd identified this protein that could potentially serve as a biomarker for the cancer, I then shifted my focus to actually detecting that protein and thus the cancer. So on this journey, I had one large epiphany moment where everything all of a sudden came together. And it came in the most unlikely of places. High school biology class, absolute stifler of innovation. Particularly with my high school biology teacher, we did not get along whatsoever. And at one point, it escalated to the point where I was blatantly ignoring instruction, and I rebelled how any high schooler would. I brought in a scientific article on carbon nanotubes. And a carbon nanotube, they're these really amazing things. They're these long, thin tubes of carbon that are an atom thick, and they're 1/50,000th the diameter of your hair. And their interesting shapes and structures give them these really amazing properties. They're kind of like the superheroes of material science. So I was reading all about these really amazing properties, feeling really suave, sneaking under my desk, kind of like a comic book wedged in my textbook, but instead science. And then we are learning about these things called antibodies. And these are a class of molecules that only react with one specific protein, in this case, a cancer biomarker. And then I was just sitting there when all of a sudden it hit me. You can combine these two concepts. You see, you essentially take these carbon nanotubes, a network of them, and you weave in this antibody, such that you have a network of nanotubes that will only react with one specific protein. but also due to the properties of these nanotubes, it will actually change its electrical properties based on the amount of protein present and thus indicate pancreatic cancer. So I could detect pancreatic cancer using a $50 ohm meter I snatched from my dad. And just as soon as I had this epiphany, my biology teacher, I swear she has eyes on the back of her head, she storms up to me all red in the face, she sees I have this article and she snatches it out, says, "What is this actual science doing in my classroom? This is a thing for the boring and mundane." But at least I think that's what she said. She probably said something completely different. And after a 30-minute lecture on respecting myself and others, I finally got my article back. And I was able to complete my research, and then I realized I'm going to need a lab, because you can't do cancer research on your kitchen countertop. Me and my brother had done some pretty crazy stuff. We cooked up high-grade explosives in our basement. We also made cholera and E. coli where we make our sandwiches. Luckily, there's no outbreak. And finally, we got ourselves on the FBI watch list by ordering some uranium off a sketchy Russian website. But you really can't blame me. It was 50% off, I mean. However, I realized I'm going to need a lab. Cancer research wasn't in the family budget. So I emailed 200 different professors at Johns Hopkins University and the National Institutes of Health, asking them, "Hey, can I work in your lab?" I emailed them this 32-page behemoth of a document outlining every little nook and cranny of my entire procedure. And then I sat back waiting for all these positive emails to pour in. And then reality hit. I got 199 rejections. And some of those professors, I realized, aren't nearly as nice as those glowing profile pictures make them seem. Some are actually very mean and go through each and every step of your procedure saying why it's wrong. And I had no clue where they got the time. Maybe it was like a hobby of theirs. However, I was undeterred. And after waiting for about a month and endless rejections, I finally got one positive email from Dr. Anirban Maitra at Johns Hopkins University. So I go in for this big interview with him, and I suppose sweatpants and a hoodie weren't the best attire for it. However, I was going to do it, and I was expecting like normal interview questions like, "What's your favorite color? Tell us about yourself." Unfortunately, this guy actually knew what he was talking about. I couldn't bamboozle him like my parents. And this led to an hour-long interrogation of my work where we set the Guinness World Book of Records for how many postdoc students you can cram into a 9-foot by 9-foot room. The answer was 28 plus me and the professor. However, eventually I got through this interview. I guessed C on all of the answers I didn't know, just like I did on my SAT. I did reasonably well on both, so valid strategy right there. But eventually I got the lab space I needed. And as soon as I started, I realized how absolutely helpless I was in the lab. I mean, first day, we had to culture some cancer cells. And pretty simple, I ended up sneezing in my cancer cell culture. I thought, cancer cells, they're pretty hard to kill, right? I mean, they have an immune system or something. No, there were tentacles growing out of the flasks the very next day. And over the course of the next 7 months, I ended up blowing up my cancer cells in a glorious fountain in the centrifuge. I was quite impressed by this. My lab mentor, not so much. And I also cooked them in the incubator. I pretty much committed cellular genocide by the end of this. However, eventually, after 7 months of screwing every imaginable scientific procedure up and sitting in the lab numerous times, crying myself to sleep, eating a Twix bar, wondering why I'd ever taken this job, I finally ended up with one small paper sensor that costs 3 cents and takes 5 minutes to run. This makes it 168 times faster, over 26,000 times less expensive, and over 400 times more sensitive than our current methods of detection. But also, the coolest thing is that I can detect it in the earliest stages of the disease, when someone has close to 100% chance of survival, and so far it has over 90% accuracy at detecting the cancer. So in the next 2 to 5 years, this patent-pending sensor could potentially lift the once dismal pancreatic cancer survival rates from 5.5% to close to 100%. And it would do similar for ovarian and lung cancer. But it wouldn't stop there, because you can simply switch out that antibody and detect an entirely different protein, meaning an entirely different disease. So you could detect anything ranging from Alzheimer's to other forms of cancer, even HIV, AIDS, and heart disease. The possibilities are literally endless with this. And on this journey, I ran into a lot of obstacles. And this is one of the major problems I see in today's education system, is that students simply don't have access to information. I mean, for example, I ran and I got told no by my biology teacher. I got told no by my parents. I even got told no by 199 professors. At least they didn't tell me to do a papier-mâché volcano for my research. However, the largest wall I ran into was actually the paywall. And that means when you want to read a scientific article, you have to cough up $35. And because of this inhibitive cost, it made my cost of doing background research that was necessary for this, it made it so much more expensive. I mean, I probably spent well over $1,000 on just background research. And a lot of students simply don't have access to that. And through these paywalls, we've really created this fundamental barrier between youth and scientific research. Because when we have all these big STEM initiatives, like we need more kids interested in STEM, but when a Katy Perry single costs 99 cents and a seminal science article costs $35, that's a bit of a mixed message there. However, this isn't just a problem for 15-year-old cancer researchers just in pancreatic cancer. It's also a problem for all researchers and in pretty much every single field. Over the past few years, we've seen over like 300% increases in journal article subscriptions. And it's become so bad that recently Harvard University released a statement saying that major periodical subscriptions, particularly to historically key providers, cannot be sustained. Continuing these on their current footing is financially untenable. Now, what does it say about the world of academic publishing, accessibility of knowledge, and the flow of information when Harvard University, the richest academic institution in the world, can't afford to continue paying for its subscriptions? By having these paywalls, we've essentially created this very rigid class system where we have the knowledge elite, those big corporate labs and big universities that can afford these articles. And there's even a stratification here. You see, Harvard and Yale, they probably have a lot more money to dole out than state universities. So what we're saying is that the top universities, okay, you guys can teach calculus and above. Everyone else, you're relegated to only algebra. And then, under that, we have the knowledge middle class, people like you and I. We have access to the internet, and we can look up the few open access articles and maybe pay for a few. And then there's the knowledge underclass. And that's 5.5 billion people who don't have access to the internet, no access to scientific knowledge whatsoever. And so we're living in a knowledge aristocracy where 0.008% of the world's population controls, and those are the only people that can read these articles. I mean, that's like taking 80 people off the street of New York City and saying, you guys are the only people who can read these articles, everyone else, too bad for you. And then 80% of the world, the vast majority of the world's population, can't access information whatsoever. And that, to me, is fundamentally incorrect. But imagine if we could live in a knowledge democracy, where superficial factors such as where you work or how much money you have wouldn't matter. Whether or not you're from China to Cambodia, from Mexico to Malaysia, whether you're a billionaire living on less than $1 a day, you'd have access to these scientific articles, because knowledge should not be a commodity and access to information should be a basic human right. The minds of the people must be free, and that means the minds of everyone, not the minds of the select few who can afford these articles. Because science, it should be agnostic. It should be indifferent to all these superficial factors. Because a girl in Pakistan should have the exact same capability as a Nobel laureate from Harvard University to do breaking research. Because ideas can come from unexpected places. And by having this, that's just morally incorrect. And we shouldn't make this change. We shouldn't institute this change just because it's an economically sound model, but because it's morally correct, and that's what we call equality. And then there's a second problem that we have in education. And that is, it's really actually apparent even here at South by Southwest. I mean, look around the room. Can you see any other students? And I can count the number of students here on 2 hands. I mean, that's really, really sad. We need to incorporate students and have their voice heard, because students, we're the victims or the benefactors of whatever education policies come. And by not including our voice in the discussion, that's education without representation. I mean, it's just absurd. We're experts in our field of education. We've been doing this for 12 years. I'm pretty sure we know what we're talking about. And I believe that we can institute these two changes and that we're really going to be seeing really exciting things in education if we do. Because think, if a 15-year-old who didn't quite know what a pancreas was could find a new way to detect pancreatic cancer, just imagine what we all could do together. Thank you. Okay. I believe we're doing question and answer. The microphone is somewhere out there. In the meantime, while the microphone is coming, how about you guys maybe look at a neighbor and maybe talk to them? They won't bite your head off. And maybe just have a conversation about how you think we should make changes in open access and the student's voice in education. So I'll give you about 2 minutes, and then we'll go to Q&A. So starting now. Okie doke, the microphone is now there. So whoever wants to come up, what brave soul will venture out there? We have a tribute. You have volunteered.
I have. I know. Okay, I've got a quick question about what has happened since you have come up with the test. How has the general medical community reacted to it? What kinds of parameters are there for doctors to use it such that pancreatic cancer, the symptoms can be identified early and the test can be administered in time for there to be a positive outcome?
So right now, I really want to stress this because there has been some overhyping in the media. Kid finds cure to cancer. No, first it was a detection method. But also the results I found were really preliminary. I want to stress that. So right now I have the international patent on the technology, and I'm talking to several large biotech companies about getting it on the market, but there's a lot more work to be done in terms of development, so it will be at least 5 to 10 years before it's on the market. And just because of clinical trials and things like that. And simply because I really can't do it because I don't have the time or money. I'm still a high school student, I have homework, and then also there's prom, of course. But so I'm trying to hand it off right now to a company that would be able to take it onto the market and be able to get it to people as soon as possible.
Hi, I want to thank you for this very inspirational talk. I'm going to say I'm a mother and I came here, although I knew your story, just so I can go back to my kids and tell the story. And now that will bring me also to my question. So I am a mother, I have a PhD, and our kids are doing extremely well because we are discussing, like your parents, I think, we're discussing science and other interesting topics in the car, in the kitchen table, at at different places. And I am, like you, supporting open resources. I'm just wondering, though, if you have thought if open access will address access will address the problem of engagement. So do you think that if those journals, do you think that if your school had the subscription to these scientific journals that you could not access otherwise, do you think that the rest of that 80% of the population or even your classmates would actually be engaged in this kind of research and deliver in the same way that you do? My point is, have you thought about all these other kids that come from families that spend their time in different ways, and whether this open access will actually engage them? Is your suggestion the key to engaging disengaged students?
So that's a really interesting point that you bring up. I was really fortunate that both my parents, who are in the science background, they did talk about science a lot at the dinner table. I mean, instead of talking football statistics, we talk science papers. And so one thing that I think is really important is that kids need to be able to see that they do have a voice in science and that they can do serious scientific research, because when you do marginalize kids' opinions, then I mean, how would you like it if someone was just like, well, you can't really do scientific research, so we're just not going to let you have access to these? I mean, of course not. And I think that these scientific research articles would really enable kids to see what's possible. because they can see that there's great science going out there, and maybe they'll find their passion in one of those scientific articles. So it might not be about doing the best scientific research ever or discovering a new way to detect cancer. It might just be about finding their passion, running with it. And I think that's one of the best things. And one last thing on that is that also in terms of scientific education, as a young scientist, I think that we do need a lot more hands-on activities in the classroom. If it was up to me, I'd just cram every classroom with as many experiments and scientific equipment as possible, because you can't learn science from a textbook. You learn it from doing it and getting your hands dirty. So why read about cells when you could look at them through a microscope? But first we need the funding for that, but also we need the articles such that people, if they are becoming interested in it, they can further their research.
Okay, thanks for your talk. And I work for an organization called Ashoka, which supports young social innovators, and we want to encourage social innovation and creative problem solving from all young people, not just a select few. How do you think our high schools need to be transformed in order to unleash the potential, not just of a few select teenagers, but all of them, so that they can make a positive difference on society?
That's an interesting question. So one thing that I really think we should do is make it a lot more flexible for students to be able to do and pursue what they're passionate about. I mean, right now, there's this thing called individual education program, and it's only meant for those with intellectual disabilities. However, why shouldn't every kid have access to an individual education program? We're all individuals, so shouldn't we all have education programs? So by tailoring our curriculum to each of our interests, then I think that's really how we're going to be able to succeed in education. And lastly on that, I think that one of the most important things is just showing kids that they can do this stuff, and that bringing in those role models and showing them that they do have the capability to do these types of research.
Thank you.
Hello, I work with an organization I hope you know, the Boy Scouts of America.
I'm actually a Life Scout.
Wonderful, congratulations, thank you. I was wondering, in the past several years, Boy Scouts has developed the STEM program, begun teaching science, the Hornaday program, which promotes nature and biology research, and are starting to build large STEM centers that even include lab space for Scouts to do research similar to yours. What do you think the possibilities of nonprofit organizations and youth groups can promote this scientific knowledge for groups outside of the schools or in conjunction with schools?
So I think that having the nonprofit sector really getting involved in it is a must, because sometimes bureaucracy isn't the best way to go about things. But I really think that they can play a super active role, especially with these maker spaces where people can explore their interests and passions and really see what they're interested in. And so by making that lab space available for kids to just tinker and let their imagination roam free, I think that's really one of the best things to do, because failure is okay. I mean, you're allowed to fail and not be in school we really demonize failure. And I think that by making it in an environment that we can fail, and we'll see a lot more interest in education.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for your talk. I'm with the National Federation of the Blind, and so we do a lot of work trying to get blind kids interested in STEM careers. And one of the big barriers that we bump up against all the time is you talk about the limited access to scientific articles. Well, imagine how much more limited that is by the technology itself when it comes to blind users. So many of these articles require 5 or 6 extra steps for a blind person to get access to. How do you see including that type of accessibility in the future, and what kinds of solutions would you foresee for that?
So I definitely think that regardless of any factor really, that you should have access to scientific articles, and really everyone can bring a unique perspective to science. So I think in order to have access to these, we should be able to have because we have copies of scientific articles in many different languages, so why shouldn't Braille be one of them? And I'm not too well versed on the actual publication of the science. That's not what I'm going for. Okay, let me think of the good word to use here. So I'm not too well versed on how to print Braille and stuff. However, I think that we would definitely be able to come up with a solution for that, because that is definitely a large issue that we should address. Although I'm not completely sure how I would create a solution to that.
Thank you.
Hello, Jack. My name is Michelle, and I teach GT students in San Antonio, middle school age. And I just want to say thank you, because we watched your TED Talk as they began their independent study project. And even though they didn't know exactly what their topic was, watching you and how passionate you felt about the inspiration behind your research really guided them to choose something that they felt passionately about. And I'm here on behalf of them as well, because when they knew I was going to come to the TED Talk or meet you and hear more of what you had to say, they were like, well, make sure you ask him, what should we do? What should we say to get our voice out there? Because you mentioned you are an expert in your own education, and our kids feel sometimes very stifled in their mandated research, mandated classes. So I guess my question to you is, what advice would you have for middle school kids who want to continue with their voice and independent study? And also they've asked me, what are your college plans?
So in terms of starting out in middle school, I would really think that just try as many things as possible. I mean, what I did is I tried literally every single sport, and that ended really badly, taking many soccer balls to the head. However, just exploring your passions, and then also when you find something, just run with it. If you're a writer, then be a writer. Don't listen to anyone's outside perspective on it, because if you're passionate about it, then you're going to succeed at it. And so just try out a bunch of things and just run with whatever you want, because at a young age, you're allowed to explore. And then in terms of college, I have no clue. I mean, somewhere nice, hopefully, but I don't know.
We'd like you in Texas.
That'd be nice. Texas is very nice.
Hi, I just wanted to share that I experience your frustration with access to journals also, but as a professional, not just as a student, because I work in a public school district and doing research and evaluation, and if I wanted to use exclusively journal articles to do a lit review, it would be prohibitively expensive. So I'm curious if any of the journals that you worked with were willing to talk to you about a reduced price, or where you think we should go with that. Because it's crossed my mind more than once that a lot of basic research is publicly funded, so the results should be publicly available.
Yeah, that's actually a really big argument that the open access community is currently using. And you see pretty much 90% or 80 or 90% in that range, that's how much of the research is currently funded by taxpayers' money. And so to make it unavailable to taxpayers is really counterintuitive and just really not right. We've already paid for it, so shouldn't we have access to the research that we funded? And so currently we're working on some legislation. It's called the FASTAR legislation. And what it's going to essentially do is make it such that all federally funded research would be freely available after 6 months. And so that's kind of the negotiation between the journals, where they'd still be able to keep their existing business model, but also the public, such that they'd be able to access all of these journals.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, I wanted to thank you personally because my daughter just passed away this past May from cancer, so it's especially touching to me that you're really working on that. But I wanted to know, when you had that aha moment, when you said you're sitting there with your smuggled article in your biology class, and that kind of all the pieces kind of fell into place, I wanted to know what that felt like for you when you kind of were just your Eureka moment.
Thank you for sharing that, first off. But for my Eureka moment, I suppose it's a really weird feeling in science when you have a Eureka moment, when it's just, that's why I love science, when all the puzzle pieces fit together, and it's just this inexplicable joy that maybe you found something that can help in the pursuit of knowledge and science, because that's what all scientists want, just to help further our knowledge of the natural world and help people. And so that Eureka moment, I realized that maybe this does have the potential to, even if it's just a little bit, to help lessen the burden and the pain of pancreatic cancer patients, ovarian cancer patients, and all those different patients.
Hi, my name is Bill. I'm the current president of the National Science Teachers Association. So I don't have a question, but I have a challenge for you. And that is, as you think of your future, think of going into teaching so that you could become the biology teacher you should have had. So.
Thank you, Jack, for an amazing talk. Great to see you live after the TED Talk. I'm going to bring the mood down, way down, but I think this is a really important issue that relates to what you talked about today. About a year ago, we lost Aaron Swartz, and his crime was breaking into a computer system at MIT because he thought, as you did, it's unfair that companies like JSTOR, Elsevier, charge prohibitively expensive rates for access to journalism. Basically, I want everybody to be aware of Aaron Swartz and his fight for a free and open internet, and to support the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And I wanted to know if you had any thoughts about this issue.
So that is a really current and breaking issue. And I do believe that the intentions of his actions were valid, where essentially he believed that information should be accessible to all, because it should be. I mean, denying information on the account of how much money you have or where you work is just blatant discrimination almost, and elitism. And so I think that, well, he could have done it in a more sophisticated way. I think it's really unfortunate how it occurred, how the end result. And that was a massive tragedy that we lost a brilliant innovator.
Thank you.
Any more questions? If not, then I will allow you to drift off into the abyss. Have a great South by Southwest conference.